So this is week 6 of the Essential C.S. Lewis. Only one more week after this one. So today we're going to try to finish almost all of the Screwtape Letters, so that starting next week we can spend some time finishing out the book and kind of concluding class as a whole. So thank you for being here with me through these past few weeks. I'll just go ahead and pray and get started. Dear Lord, we thank you once more for this morning, and we just pray that you will be with us, Lord. Just sharpen our minds and soften our hearts to messages that you have for us this morning in church. We thank you once more for the opportunity to worship together with other believers, to spend some time to focus on you. We just pray for your blessings, and we ask all this in your name. Right, so as I said, it is week 6. We finished Mere Christianity in the first 4 weeks. We did the first 10 or 11 chapters of Screwtape Letters last week. As I said, this week, I know it looks like a lot of chapters, 11 through 30. Some of the chapters in this book are very short. They're just a couple of pages. So it's a lot easier reading. I think it goes a lot faster. But as I said, if we can sort of finish the bulk of Screwtape Letters today, then next week we can focus on the very last chapter, which is probably my favorite, and just wrap up the class as a whole. So, for a little bit of review, I covered some of Lewis's approaches to writing fiction last week. So I talked about how his fiction and his nonfiction tend to correspond with each other. They sort of mutually enrich each other, and I talked about some books that do that. Talked about this idea of restoration, the idea that certain aspects of Christianity or about reality can become boring to us. They can become overly familiar to us. So Lewis's idea is by transplanting them into a fictional world, representing them to us that way, that can awaken some of those old kind of appreciations and feelings for kind of the second time. Talked about joy, for Lewis, this idea of the hope of heaven, this kind of desire that cannot be fulfilled by anything on earth. It's a very powerful, moving part of the Christian experience for him, and so he tries to capture those in some of his fictional works. And I talked about his background studying medieval and Renaissance literature, so he's going to be operating, I think, sometimes in ways that are unfamiliar to us if we just look at modern literature. But if we look at his medieval Renaissance influences, a lot of what he's doing finds its base there. Obviously, we're in Screwtape Letters. This picture is from a newspaper that a friend of Lewis's wrote a book review in about the book itself. Screwtape Letters was published in 1941, but obviously kind of his most famous work. I think probably the book that rocketed him to stardom. And last week, after talking about where Lewis might have gotten some of his ideas about demons, what they're like from certain other books of Christian literature, some other Bible verses, I talked about this idea of spiritual sight. And sight here is really synonymous with knowledge. The idea that demons exist kind of as pure spirits. And so that makes them more like God and the angels than us in some respects. There's some things that they can see better than we can. Obviously, they're also evil and kind of fully corrupted. So I mentioned that there are some things that they cannot see, even though we as Christians can see by the working of the Holy Spirit, by the revelation of God's Word. And last time I talked about how Lewis portrays the church, God, and demons themselves as having this sort of double reality, that the humans see it this way, in its sort of earthly, pathetic, weak form, but we demons, we see it in its sort of terrifying, spiritual, actual, eternal reality. So staying on that spiritual sight theme a little bit today, I want to look at the other side. So we talked about things that demons can see, and one of my favorite verses in the Bible that talks about this is James 2:19. You believe that God is one, you do well. The demons also believe and shudder. So there's this idea that knowledge itself is not necessarily all that you need for salvation. The idea that, yeah, it is good to believe in God. It's better to believe in God than to not believe in God. But we share that knowledge with the demons, and they are not saved at all, right? So that sufficient. So we talked about the church, God, and the demons, and I kind of used some pictures to draw out some quotes in the Screwtape Letters where he says, humans see the church like this, we see it like this. And those were mostly true. The way that the demons saw it were more accurate spiritually than the way that we saw it, and he was highlighting that. And I want to talk about the war, right? This came out in 1941, so it's being written again during World War II. Lewis himself had fought in the earlier World War. And if you happen to read through chapters 1 through 10, you will notice that Screwtape, the elder demon, has a very particular attitude towards World War II. And I would call that attitude as somewhat dismissive. So I plucked a quote out of chapter 24. This is Screwtape's attitude towards the war. He's talking to Wormwood here. Pray, do not fill your letters with rubbish about this European war. Its final issue is, no doubt, important, but that is a matter for the High Command. I am not in the least interested in knowing how many people in England have been killed by bombs. In what state of mind they died, I can learn from the office at this end. That they were going to die sometime, I knew already. Please keep your mind on your work. We see this difference, right? Wormwood is a younger devil, he's out in the field, so he's really excited about the war. He thinks, awesome, this is going to throw humanity into chaos, people are going to die, there's going to be violence and bloodshed. That's great. We demons, we love that sort of stuff. But Screwtape, for whatever reason, is always telling Wormwood, it's not that big of a deal. You can't get excited about the war. You got to stay on the task. You have to keep your eyes on the prize. So I want to open this question up to you all. Why might that be the case? Why might Lewis write Screwtape as having sort of a dismissive attitude towards the World War?
Well, in one of the chapters, he kind of talked about don't get drunk on it,
Yeah.
telling more, don't get all excited like you mentioned about the violence, all the stuff
Right.
that you love. But again, the focus is because the war could go two different ways with an individual.
Sure.
It could either take them off to the enemy, to God, or it could work to our advantage to bring them down. So it's more, he sees it, I think, more of it as just a tool to
Right.
use than something, that gets him excited.
Yeah, I wish I could have pulled that quote out. We didn't have time, but it's excellent, right? In which he's actually counseling Wormwood temperance. I talked about this last week. The idea that the demons, for some reason, sometimes they tell each other to actually practice virtues, and one of them is temperance. Screwtape says, don't get so excited about the initial shock and terror of the war, because if it ends up leading him closer to God, or if he dies as a Christian, then it's actually going to work out worse for us. So try to focus on making him as miserable, as far away from God as possible. Because you're right, and he says in other sections that war is reality in a certain sort of harsh way. So sometimes it makes people turn to God, and that might be why God allows things like war in these cases. So it's true, it could go either way. Are there other reasons that Screwtape might not think World War II is that big of a deal?
Well, he's probably seen other things. There have been similar wars in the past
Sure.
for thousands of years. And he's like, it's just another world war.
Yeah,
What's the big deal?
it's true.
What you see here.
Yeah, wars and rumors of wars, right? That's how it always was. And he does mention World War I also. So it's possible for him with kind of a cosmic sense of time. It's just another thing. I think that's very well said. What else? What are other reasons that?
I didn't read it, but I'll hazard a guess.
Sure.
It's the nature grace thing. He basically says there's a spiritual world, we should be more concerned about that. The natural world kind of,
It's true.
yeah.
That's excellent. We talked about last week it's kind of a Gnosticism, the idea that spirit is all good, flesh is all bad, and there's this superior attitude that demons have towards human because, well, they're fleshy. We're spiritual, right? We're kind of automatically higher and better. These are great answers, and I want to turn your attention to a quote from an essay Lewis wrote called "Learning in Wartime." This is not Screwtape speaking. This is C.S. Lewis, the man, speaking, and he's giving an address I believe it's a sermon at Oxford University. So he's talking to new students that just joined Oxford during the war. And the question he starts out by asking is, what sort of logic is there behind going in to study literature during World War II? Like, why would we possibly do that, right? How does that make any kind of sense? And this is kind of his response. So he compares this to this idea of fiddling in Rome. Isn't it sort of wasting your time? Shouldn't we be focused on the war? Shouldn't all of our nation's resources be put towards that? Isn't that fiddling in Rome? Okay. But to a Christian, the true tragedy of Nero, who famously fiddled while Rome burned, must not be that he fiddled while the city was on fire, but that he fiddled on the brink of hell. Every Christian who comes to university must at all times face a question compared with which the questions raised by war are relatively unimportant. He must ask himself how it is right or even psychologically possible for creatures who are every moment advancing either to heaven or to hell to spend any fraction of the little time allowed to them on this earth on such comparative trivialities as literature or art, mathematics, or biology. What he's saying is that just because we're in a war, that's not actually the urgent situation that we are in. That is an urgent situation. But the real urgent situation that we are in is the spiritual war, right? Where the stakes are eternity, souls. So the war thing, it's all well and good, but actually it unearths a larger problem. He keeps going here. The war creates no absolutely new situation. It simply aggravates the permanent human situation so that we can no longer ignore it. Human life has always been lived on the edge of a precipice. And there's a spiritual reality to that. There's obviously a natural reality, like we were talking about, that there's always conflict. There's always something going on. But spiritually, we're standing on the edge of a precipice, right? I think that another way to say this is we're always at war. Right now, we in America feel like we're in peace. We haven't had an open war or whatever. But the spiritual reality is, and I mentioned Ephesians 6 last time, right? Our battle is not with flesh and blood. We are in a spiritual war. And so the funny thing about someone like Screwtape, someone like Wormwood, to them, they've never not been at war. So what Screwtape is saying is that if the humans need a physical war to break out for them to get into military mode, we don't need that. We're always in military mode. I mentioned Paralandra last week, where there's this kind of repeat of the fall of man, in which there's a Satan character tempting an Eve character, but there's a Christian also trying to fight off the Satan and prevent the fall. And one of the advantages that the Satan character has is that he doesn't need to sleep. So there's this kind of debate when the Christian is awake that Satan will tell something to Eve and the Christian can kind of try to reason with him and talk about the Bible. But when he goes to sleep, Satan, it doesn't, right? He just keeps sort of filling this woman with all these lies and temptations. And every time the human guy wakes up, he kind of finds the Eve character slightly worse off than when he went to bed. And so there's this natural way that we humans, we lose some of the sight. And I think that's why it's important to remember the spiritual war that we're in is at least as real as something like World War II going on around us. And honestly, it's more real. The stakes are higher, the enemies are greater, right? But the forces on our side are also greater. So I think that's one kind of quirk about Screwtape. He's always telling Wormwood, stop telling me about what the armies are doing. I don't care. Just tell me about your patient, your target. That's what your focus should be on, because if he gets away, none of it matters. It's kind of an interesting, it's another one of those things where we can kind of learn from this presentation of demons in that they're focused. They're always focused. And Lewis talks about, in this essay, it's a really great one. I would recommend that you check it out yourself. But Lewis says that the way that humans focus is different, right? We do have to sleep, we do have to live in the world, but in a way, all of our lives should be devoted to Christ. We shouldn't have to think about, when you live as a Christian, you're only doing one activity all the time. all of it should be devoted to Christ with that mission in mind. And that's going to look different. It's going to look different for how a demon can have a single-minded focus towards a spiritual war, and for a human to have a single-minded focus on the spiritual war. But it's possible. And one of the strategies that come out in the Screwtape Letters that I didn't really get a chance to talk about, but Lewis talks about what's called the law of undulation, the idea that a spiritual being is eternal, they don't really exist in time in the same way, but humans, we do exist in time. We can't stay on a straight line. So the closest Lewis says, or Screwtape says, that humans get to staying in a straight line is by going up and down. You see how that's still a straight line. That's as close as we can get if we have to keep moving. And so in the Screwtape Letters, Screwtape is always telling Wormwood, you gotta watch out. They go through these troughs and these peaks. Just because they're in a trough right now doesn't mean you did something good. And in fact, God is using the troughs much more than he's using those peaks. So it's something that I didn't really get to mention, but it's another part of this idea of living in time. Okay, let's get back on the topic of spiritual blindness. So I do want to switch gears now to elements of the Screwtape Letters, where Screwtape himself cannot see something. Sometimes he lies about it, as I mentioned last time, right? Sometimes he just tells the truth, which is awesome. Sometimes he straight up lies, and we're supposed to understand that what the opposite of what he's saying is true. But sometimes, because of his own limitations, the way that he's described something, he's almost right, but not quite. I actually think that these are some of those fascinating moments in the Screwtape Letters, and because they're a little bit more complicated, I'd like to focus on them. So the question that I want us to have in the back of our minds is, what is the devil blind to? What sort of things can he not see? Even if he physically saw it, he just couldn't make sense of it because of the way that he is. And again, I said, blindness and ignorance are really synonymous in this context. So one of these things is joy. The devil cannot understand joy. So at one point, Screwtape starts advising Wormwood on laughter, the different kinds of human laughter and the different causes of laughter. He tells Wormwood, don't just think that every kind of laughter is good for us. Sometimes the enemy, God, can use laughter also. The first source of laughter he talks about is joy. You will see joy among friends and lovers reunited on the eve of a holiday. What the real cause of joy is, we do not know. Something like it is expressed in much of that detestable art, which the humans call music, and something like it occurs in heaven, a meaningless acceleration in the rhythm of celestial experience, quite opaque to us. Laughter of this kind does us no good and should always be discouraged. Besides, the phenomenon is of itself disgusting, and a direct insult to the realism, dignity, and austerity of hell. So, laughter is offensive to Screwtape. He's too serious, he's too high-minded, right? These humans, they're disgusting, and really what he often says is God himself is disgusting for allowing this kind of phenomenon to take place. But he says, right, we don't really know what the cause of joy is. And I guess you could music under that category of another thing that he can't quite understand. It's quite opaque to us. But he knows that he hates it. And actually, this is a lot of the way that demons know things in the Screwtape Letters. It's not by knowing their true nature, it's by observing them and then deciding whether we can use them for our advantages or not. So you'll find that oftentimes their knowledge is very pragmatic. What can I do about this? What can I use this for? How can I use it? Another thing that Screwtape doesn't quite understand or is ignorant of is virtue. So this is a quote from a later chapter. They're discussing, if the patient is in war, how should we make him respond to the war? Should we try to make him a coward? Should we try to make him so brave that he becomes prideful of his own courage? And this is how he goes. Well, I'm afraid it is no good trying to make him brave. Our research department has not yet discovered, though success is hourly expected, how to produce any virtue. This is a serious handicap. To be greatly and effectively wicked, a man needs some virtue. What would Attila have been without his courage? Or Shylock without self-denial as regards the flesh? But as we cannot supply these qualities ourselves, we can only use them as supplied by the enemy. And this means leaving him a kind of foothold in those men whom otherwise we have made most securely our own. A very unsatisfactory arrangement, but I trust we shall one day learn to do better. I mentioned this last week, that some of the attitudes that Screwtape gives the kind of bureaucracy of hell match up with trends he saw in his own modern society. And one of those is this idea that science is going to solve all of our problems. So the demons don't know how to encourage someone to be virtuous. They just can't do it. And yet, Screwtape's optimism is kind of praiseworthy, right? We haven't been able to accomplish this for thousands of years, but hourly we expect to finally figure it out. So you gotta hand it to the guy. You know, he's sort of hopeful that one day evil forces will figure out how to make people be good. And it's sort of surprising for us to think that that's something the devil wants to do in the first place. Why would the devil want people to be virtuous? But as we see here, what Screwtape is saying is that the more virtue a person is given, the greater evil we can tempt them to. And I think we see this concept in the Bible, right? Jesus has that line where he says, if you think about how great the light is of a man, how great is the darkness if that light becomes dark? And so there's this constant warning about pride, about temptation, no matter what your level of kind of spiritual maturity or excellence or virtue, that I think pervades the Bible. Screwtape is flipping that on its head. If we could somehow figure out how to make this person more virtuous, then later on we could somehow figure out how to make them even more evil, but we can't do it. And I think it's really funny that Lewis has Screwtape saying, we need to leave God a foothold, right? Because there's that famous verse that says, don't leave the devil a foothold. He's kind of inverting all these things. But ultimately, virtue is another thing that they don't really understand. All they can do is exploit it. How can we exploit the virtue that God has given? Another thing that you'd be surprised, but the devils don't really understand, is pleasure itself. This is another chapter, or another quote from 29. Never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. I know we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is to encourage the humans to take the pleasures which our enemy has produced at times, or in ways, or in degrees which he has forbidden. And I apologize, this is actually from chapter 5, it's not from chapter 29. But this is another thing. We kind of associate certain pleasures with God and certain other pleasures with demons. But what Screwtape is saying is that we don't actually understand where pleasures come from. And what does he say again? All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. He actually says later that the ideal thing that a devil would do would be to tempt a human to sin in such a way that there was no pleasure in the sin. And another point he says that whenever a human sins, and whatever pleasure kind of attends that sin, that's not our doing. We wish it wasn't there. We just want them to be miserable. So this is an interesting thing, because again, you think of temptation as involving some promise of some pleasure. And obviously this book is very concerned with temptation and the mechanics of it. But you'll find that, again, Screwtape is offended that something like pleasure exists. One of my favorite lines in the book is he's telling Wormwood that humans can be happy sometimes in sort of this ignorant way, because they don't really know what the future holds. They're just kind of happy because they're in a good mood. So how should Wormwood respond to this kind of happiness? Well, Screwtape says, you should put a stop to it. Why should they be happy? And that's how the chapter ends. So there's this malice that the demons have. They just don't want us to be happy for any reason. And if you see it, you get the sense that they live in a world without that, without any pleasure. But the way that they've handled that is this kind of Gnostic superiority, that pleasure is sort of vulgar and common, and we've ascended. We know better. You know, we're higher, we're more principled. Okay, joy, virtue, pleasure. I want to spend probably most of the rest of our time on love, on Screwtape's inability to really understand love. There are two visions of love in Screwtape Letters. One I'm calling infernal love, in sort of scare quotes, because it's not actual love. And then there's celestial love, which is God's love. So a little bit about infernal love. This is the love that the demons have towards each other, towards humans. It's really funny because every chapter is a letter. So Screwtape starts every letter by saying, "Dear Wormwood," and he signs off every letter by saying, "Affectionately, Screwtape." So there's some sort of pretense or rhetoric about affection, about love. But it becomes very clear what sort of love that really is. This is something Screwtape says about God in chapter 14. "For we must never forget what is the most repellent and inexplicable trait in our enemy. He really loves the hairless bipeds he has created." This is something that Wormwood, especially in the first half of the book, Screwtape keeps telling Wormwood, you have to remember that God actually loves them. As sort of absurd and impossible as that is, he really loves them. And you have to keep that in mind. How do the demons relate to humans? To us, a human is primarily food. Our aim is the absorption of its will into ours, the increase of our own area of selfhood at its expense. We want cattle who can finally become food. He, that is the enemy, wants servants who can finally become sons. That excellent section where Wormwood is first excited about the war, and Screwtape calls the Wormwood's target as a cup of sort of misery and torture that you can put to your lips whenever you want. This is the way that humans see us, that demons see us. It's this consumption. It's sort of eating and preying upon each other. We can probably think of some verses in the Bible where it talks about that way of thinking, the way that the devil looks on humans as wanting to devour them, right? And so later on in the book, Screwtape talks about the philosophy of hell. Why is this the case? Why do we think about humans this way? The whole philosophy of hell rests on recognition of the axiom that one thing is not another thing, and especially that oneself is not another self. My good is my good, and your good is yours. What one gains, another loses. To be means to be in competition. That's the way that the devils see everything. This does have a lot of correspondence with a lot of secular philosophy and other things that came out probably around the time Lewis started, but certainly later. This idea that everything is a competition, everything is just a struggle for power. And Screwtape is saying, this is what hell is. We rest on this axiom, meaning it's something that we think is so true that it's impossible to prove. It's just so fundamental. That my good is my good, and your good is yours. What one gains, another loses. In contrast, we look at the enemy. Now the enemy's philosophy, that's God's philosophy, is nothing more or less than one continued attempt to evade this very obvious truth, meaning the thing he said earlier, that one person's good is theirs, other person's good is theirs, and everything is always gain or loss. But he, that is God, aims at a contradiction. Things are to be many, yet somehow also one. The good of oneself is to be the good of another. This impossibility he calls love, and the same monotonous panacea can be detected under all he does and even all he is or claims to be. Thus, he is not content, even himself, to be a sheer arithmetical unity. He claims to be three as well as one, in order that this nonsense about love may find a foothold in his own nature. If you remember in Mere Christianity, in book 4, he starts talking about theology. Lewis thinks it's very important to realize that God's triune nature is founded on this idea of love, that there's this mutual love within God himself. So it's intrinsic to how God what God tells us about himself. It's intrinsic to Christianity, it's fundamental. But Screwtape's idea is that this love thing, it's just not true, right? It just can't exist, because we know that one thing is one thing, and if I gain, that means you must lose out somehow. And so all God is doing when he's saying he's motivated by love, he's not seeing reason. He's not being honest. And this is interesting, that somehow Screwtape has this idea that God loves humans, but also he believes that love is philosophically impossible, that it has to be a lie, it has to be a trick. So I'm calling this next section Screwtape's mistake, because Screwtape actually catches himself at the very end of the book and realizes that he's put forth a contradiction somehow. So he addresses his contradiction to Wormwood. If, as I have clearly shown, all selves are by their very nature in competition, and therefore the enemy's idea of love is a contradiction in terms, what becomes of my reiterated warning that he really loves the human vermin and really desires their freedom and continued existence? I hope, my dear boy, you've not shown my letters to anyone. Not that it matters, of course. Anyone would see that the appearance of heresy into which I have fallen is purely accidental, but do keep everything under lock and key. This is a strange there's something going on in the background. Screwtape feels like he's made a mistake. He's potentially exposed himself. He's incriminated himself somehow by talking about God's love in this way. The appearance of heresy, right? We'll come back to that other part, but what is the heresy that Screwtape is worried that he might have been on record as saying? The truth is, I slipped by mere carelessness into saying that the enemy really loves the humans. That, of course, is an impossibility. Okay, so this is Screwtape backtracking on something he said earlier. In fact, he's been saying it a lot. He's continually telling Wormwood, God really loves the humans, you gotta watch out. But that's the heresy. The heresy, which is something you can be punished for believing, in hell, is to say that God loves humans, or that love is even possible at all. So now Screwtape is saying, it's just a manner of speaking. Don't get worried about it. That, of course, is an impossibility. He is one being; they are distinct from him. Their good cannot be his. All his talk about love must be a disguise for something else. He must have some real motive for creating them and taking so much trouble about them. The reason one comes to talk as if he really had this impossible love is our utter failure to find out their real motive. What does he stand to make out of them? That is the insoluble question. So Screwtape is saying that we demons, we know what love really is. It's exploiting someone. It's taking advantage of them. We know that has to be the case, right? All this stuff that God says about wanting other people's good, and if you worship me, that'll be good for you, that has to be a lie. But we just can't figure out exactly what the truth is. In what way is everything that God has done actually taking advantage of the humans, right? And I think Lewis loves to come back to this idea that if you have an evil framework, someone could tell you the truth and show you definitive proof of it, and you would be unable to see it. It would just be such a strong, you could call it a mental block or a spiritual block, that you can just look at something existing in front of you and say, no, I don't see it. There's no way that can exist. So there's this weird thing about how is it that demons, they read the Bible, right? When we see Satan tempting Christ, he's quoting scripture at him. So you always ask, what? Don't the demons, haven't they read Revelation? Don't they know that it's not going to work out well for them? What's going on? And so I think Lewis is getting at this idea that their philosophy is so completely, in contrast to Christianity, to truth, to God's nature, that actually, if you tell them the truth, they cannot believe it. And he gets to this, right? I do not see any harm to tell you that this very problem was a chief cause of our father's quarrel with the enemy, right? We're talking about Satan's fall. When the creation of man was first mooted, and when even at that stage, the enemy freely confessed that he foresaw a certain episode about a cross, our father very naturally sought an interview and asked for an explanation. This, I think, is a dramatization that we see in Milton's Paradise Lost. The idea that when God first created man, before he even did it, he knows everything. So he already knew about the fall, he already knew about the need for Christ to die, right, to take our place, and to be resurrected to bring us back. And so Milton has this really interesting view of having all that planned out before man is even created. So that's kind of what Screwtape is saying. And when he says the enemy, that's God. When he's saying our father, that's Satan, right? The enemy gave no reply, except to produce the cock and bull story about disinterested love, which he has been circulating ever since. This, our father, naturally could not accept. He implored the enemy to lay his cards on the table, and gave him every opportunity. He admitted he felt a real anxiety to know the secret. The enemy replied, I wish with all my heart that you did. It was, I imagine, at this stage in the interview that our father's disgust at such an unprovoked lack of confidence caused him to remove himself an indefinite distance from the presence with such a suddenness, which has given rise to the ridiculous enemy's story that he was forcibly thrown out of heaven.
Well, this is actually pivotal because it's the law of non-contradiction.
Yeah,
In
exactly.
the heresy, you find something that's not reasonable, so how can you maintain your position?
Right.
And so this is where he backs him in the corner.
I think so. And it's so good, right? Because there's this self-justifying, self-aggrandizing nature in the way Screwtape tells the story. Satan is so reasonable. He's so generous. He gave God every opportunity to just explain himself, just be honest with him. But God is unreasonable. He doesn't trust in his most trusted advisor. Satan, he pulls the old, you can't fire me, I quit. And that's the way that Screwtape is thinking about the story. It's so ridiculous, right? It's not even like the opposite of the truth. It's a demon looking at actually what happened and getting exactly the wrong conclusions from that sort of thing. So he continues. Since then, we have begun to see why our oppressor was so secretive, right? Secretive meaning Satan sees God love humans. And he says, well, I know that's not the real reason. Why are you doing it? And God says, it's because I love them. And again, Satan says, I know that's not the real reason. You can tell me it's okay. And God just says, I wish you understood what I'm saying, right? You see how from Satan's side, that sounds condescending. But if we know the heart of God, it's really sad, right? God wishes that people that hate him would come to him. So again, it's all here. Since then, we have begun to see why our oppressor was so secretive. His throne depends on the secret. We know that he cannot really love. Nobody can. It doesn't make sense. If we could only find out what he's really up to. Hypothesis after hypothesis has been tried, and still we can't find it out. Yet, we must never lose hope. More and more complicated theories, fuller and fuller collections of data, richer rewards for researchers who make progress, more and more terrible punishments for those who fail. All of this, pursued and accelerated to the very end of time, cannot surely fail to succeed. I almost don't know what to say. I mean, we see all of that in play in this section, right? This is the attitude. I mean, this has to be the attitude of a force that is hurtling towards a destiny that's already been spelled out. It's already been spelled out for them. We know how Revelation ends. And so the only way that someone could be actively fighting against God, knowing that it's prophesied that they're going to fail, is by somehow being stuck in this headspace. It's fully voluntary, right? That there's no element of force or limitation. And again, Screwtape demonstrates how smart he is. The devil is a keen observer of anthropology and sociology and probably literature. And yet they still do this. And so I think this is Lewis's sort of hypothesis. Maybe this is the kind of headspace that you need to be opposed to, an eternal, omnipresent, omniscient, all-loving God. And this,
I do have one more thing. I think what happens, you've heard the expression, you bought the question. So you basically, somebody presents a question to you, they present a certain presupposition, you accept them without thinking about it.
Sure.
And then you go and then try to answer within the framework. What I'm seeing the problem with now Eastern spirituality is different than Western because, everything is spiritual in Eastern spirituality, which is a strong point actually. And I think what's happening with with Lewis is he's saying, well, there's this secular world out there that's, this is neutral.
Mm.
And so, and that's the question we're buying, is that when we get this neutral world here that God's not really in control of,
Sure.
we get to make our choice one way or another, rather than assuming that God's actually in control of all things.
Sure.
So that's what I'm observing so far.
I can see that. I know that he mentions Eastern spirituality kind of offhandedly a couple of times. There are some descriptions of Satan that sound very similar to this kind of Eastern idea of losing your selfhood and kind of all slipping back into one divine consciousness. But I take your point. I mean, I think that it's
we bought into this secular reasoning.
Sure.
That's where I'm going.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think you find Screwtape often taking credit for a lot of secular reasoning. He's kind of saying, the humans all think this way thanks to the hard work of our research department or something. So I think so. I think that's definitely part of it here. I just want to draw your attention to what I'm calling the A plot and the B plot of the Screwtape Letters, right? So the A plot is what's going on Earth, with the war and everything. So we have the target, who starts out not a Christian. Pretty early on, he becomes a Christian. World War II begins. The target matures, he endures some temptation, but he's generally growing in his spiritual life. At one point, he falls in love with a Christian girl. The London Blitz begins, so presumably he's living in London. There's all this bombing going on, and eventually he dies. Sorry to spoil, I think I told you that last week. But at the very end of the Screwtape Letter, the target dies. And that's the A plot, right? That's sort of what's going on in the human world. But the reason I'm mentioning this now is that the B plot, I think, is founded on this idea of infernal love, of consumption. The idea is that the demons don't just view humans this way, they actually view each other this way also. So the relationship between Screwtape and Wormwood, it sounds like Wormwood's his uncle. The reason we have these letters is he's giving him all this advice, presumably Screwtape wants his nephew to succeed and do well. But that's not really the case. We'll find that Wormwood is trying to exploit Screwtape, and Screwtape is very happily trying to exploit Wormwood. And sometimes that breaks out into the open. So that's what I'm calling the B plot. What's going on between Screwtape and Wormwood? And this is something that it's present. So it's there, but it's not really foregrounded. So the B plot is Screwtape advises Wormwood, and we start the book kind of already in that mode. But at some point, Screwtape makes that mistake I talked to you, right? He says this thing that, God really loves people, and Wormwood actually picks up on the fact that Screwtape should not have done that. Another thing that Screwtape does sometimes in the letters is he's insulting Wormwood. You don't know what you're talking about, I don't know what you guys do. At one point he says, the training college, the Tempters College, they must not have taught you this. They must have really gone downhill since I was there. He insults the headmaster of the college, and he even threatens Wormwood a couple of times. If you don't do this right, I'm gonna use my power to punish you. So Wormwood, very sneakily, informs on Screwtape to the secret police of hell. He sends Screwtape's letters to the secret police and must have said something like, hey, this guy Screwtape, he's a heretic, he's slandering people at the Tempters College, he's kind of, I think you should look into him, right? So that happens pretty late in the book. Screwtape uses his own connections in the government to privately settle this sort of thing. So he doesn't get into any trouble. But he's found out Wormwood's plan, right? So he actually confronts Wormwood sort of offhandedly. He just says, he writes a normal letter filled with advice, and he just has a paragraph saying, by the way, that matter with the secret police, I've resolved it. So if you thought that was going to work, nice try. And then we know that Wormwood fails, right? Ultimately, this man, this target, he becomes a Christian, he doesn't fall away, he dies in his faith, and so Screwtape presumably eats Wormwood. That's how the book ends. And the last chapter is so excellent, so we'll save that one for later. But there's this constant back and forth between Screwtape and Wormwood, even though we wouldn't have the book, The Screwtape Letters, if Screwtape wasn't trying to help Wormwood in some way. Really, their relationship the entire time is just who can outdo the other, who can exploit the other. So when I showed you those pictures from Dante's Inferno last class, I was talking about how the devils don't have a complete chaos or there's a kind of hierarchy in hell, there's some structure, there's something like submission or temperance we're talking about. Really, what Lewis is saying is, it's just an appearance. At its core, every individual member of hell really is just out for themselves. And they would happily, prey upon any human, any other demon that they could. It's really a might makes right kind of world down there. And it ends with Screwtape, defeating Wormwood and saying, I win because I'm stronger and you're weaker. So there's really no love in the traditional sense between them. I think that this takes us up to chapter 31. 31 is the very last chapter, so I said we'll save that one for next time. But I hope it's become clear that I'm not covering a lot of what Screwtape is actually saying to Wormwood in this class. When we went through Mere Christianity, personally I felt that there's a lot of wisdom in Mere Christianity, but it can be a little bit more difficult to get it. Whereas I felt with Screwtape Letters, the wisdom, the actual insight, is not as difficult. So for the class, I wanted to focus on aspects of it that I didn't really pick up on the first couple times I read it, and I wanted to contrast it with Mere Christianity. But I do want to mention just the amount of wisdom that is in this book, right? I've been reading this, and so I think it's just made me look at my own life and sort of imagine what kind of Screwtape letter is being written about me when I'm in the situation that I'm in. Because very often the things that Screwtape warns Wormwood not to let his target think about are his own temptation. So very often he tells Wormwood, whenever the patient we're tempting him, don't let him know that we're tempting him. Because if he realizes, I'm being tempted right now, he will run to God. But if he thinks about it any other way, if he just thinks about, I've had a hard day, or I deserve to take a break, or even if it's physical or mental or psychological, as long as he's not thinking about the spiritual reality of what's going on, we're okay. One of my favorite passages is Wormwood asking Screwtape about pride, right? How can I make my target feel prideful when he's not that way normally? And so Screwtape says, okay, here's the strategy. The next time he does something humble, whisper into his ear, man, I'm being really humble right now. And then he'll start feeling pride. Now, if he realizes what you did, he might pray and ask God for humility to take his pride away. At which point you can whisper, man, that was such a humble prayer. But be warned, if you do this too many times, you'll awaken the patient's sense of humor, he'll realize what you're doing, and he'll go to bed. So every single time there's this process of temptation, Screwtape puts forward this warning to Wormwood that these strategies work, but our power is limited, right? Temptations don't last forever. And as soon as your target realizes that, he'll realize that if he just holds on, the temptation will go away. We just have this limitation. So I think that's the kind of thing that I've just thought about a lot going throughout the week. So I think this kind of thinking, it's speculative, I grant you, but I think it's built on the ideas that are clearly in Scripture, that the Bible wants us to know, that there's this spiritual battle going on. And when we think about Jesus telling Peter, Satan has asked me if he could sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. So Jesus wants us to know that this kind of stuff is going on. And so I think that's how I've sort of found this book transform me, just my own thinking. And like I said, there's a lot in here that I'm just not covering. I'm really covering it more from this sort of thing. It's present that maybe is more under the surface, but the stuff on the surface is excellent and largely, uncommented in this class. For next week, as I said, we'll try to get up to chapter 30, which is the second to last chapter. The class after that, the last class, we'll just go through chapter 31 because it's really lovely, and we'll kind of do maybe a retrospective on the class as a whole and Lewis and fiction and nonfiction. But yeah, I think that's where I'll end things for for today. As I said, I'm posting all these lectures on YouTube, so that's the URL. I can email it out, I can email slides if people want. But yeah, thought we could end a little bit early today. And if anyone has any comments or questions, then now would be the time.
Kind of reminds me of the business world. You have corporations cooperating,
Yeah.
what is beneficial to them,
Right.
looking for the opportunity to eat the other person.
Yeah, exactly. At any time.